Imagine, if you will, a world draped in silence. Not a peaceful, gentle silence, but a deep and profound emptiness that stretches across continents. 70,000 years ago, the Earth was a place of dramatic extremes and breathtaking beauty. A planet in the raw, its landscapes untamed and its climates unforgiving. Vast ice sheets gleaming under a pale sun gripped much of the northern hemisphere in a frozen embrace, locking away immense volumes of the world's water and exposing land bridges that are now submerged deep beneath the ocean's waves. Elsewhere, sprawling deserts were even drier and more extensive than they are today, while dense, primordial forests teemed with life that was both magnificent and terrifying. This was the world of the late Pleistocene, a stage set for an epic drama of survival, a drama in which our own species, Homo sapiens, very nearly did not see the final act. This is a story written in the faintest of echoes, a narrative pieced together not from ancient scrolls or stone tablets, but from the subtle language of genetics, the silent testimony of fossils, and the slow revealing secrets of the climate record. It is the story of a bottleneck, a moment in deep time when the entire global population of Homo sapiens plummeted to a perilously low number. We are not speaking of a decline of millions, or even hundreds of thousands. Current scientific estimates, drawn from sophisticated analyses of our genetic code, suggest that for a period, the number of breeding adults may have shrunk to somewhere between just 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. To put that into a perspective that is as staggering as it is humbling, the number of human beings alive on the entire planet was likely less than the number of people who can fit into a large modern sports stadium. Every single person alive today, all 8 billion of us, from the most remote tribes to the greatest metropolises, are descended from that small, resilient band of survivors. The question that naturally arises from this astonishing fact is perhaps the most profound in our shared history. Why? What cataclysm, what confluence of events, could have brought a species as intelligent and adaptable as ours to the very brink of extinction? The answer, as we are beginning to understand, is not a simple one. It is not the tale of a single catastrophe, but rather a perfect storm of challenges, a cascade of environmental, climatic, and even internal biological factors that aligned to push our ancestors to their absolute limit. For a long time, our view of ancient humanity was one of steady, inevitable progressor, triumphant march out of Africa, leading to global domination. But the genetic evidence tells a different, far more dramatic story. It reveals a history marked by false starts, dead ends, and a desperate, skin-of-our-teeth survival. The clues are hidden within our DNA, in the surprising lack of genetic diversity found in modern human populations compared to other great apes. This lack of variation points directly to a severe population reduction in our past, a genetic bottleneck that squeezed our diversity down to a mere fraction of what it once was. We are a genetically homogeneous species, and this homogeneity is a lasting monument to a time when we were few. As we embark on this exploration, we will journey back to this world of ice and uncertainty. We will examine the formidable climatic forces that were reshaping the planet, making it a colder, drier, and more volatile place. We will consider the evidence of a colossal volcanic eruption that may have plunged the globe into a prolonged volcanic winter, disrupting climates and food chains for generations. We will look at the ecological competition our species faced from other hominins, like the robust and well-adapted Neanderthals, who had already mastered survival in the challenging Eurasian environments. We must also confront the possibility that our own nascent cognitive abilities, the very thing that would eventually become our greatest asset, might have initially made us more vulnerable, requiring more energy and more stable social structures that were difficult to maintain in a collapsing world. This narrative is not merely an academic exercise in understanding the past. It is a fundamental part of our identity. It explains why, despite our vast numbers today, we are all so genetically similar. It hints at why we may carry within us a latent propensity for both incredible cooperation and devastating conflict, traits that may have been forged in the crucible of extreme scarcity. The story of the bottleneck is a story of resilience, of a handful of communities who, through a combination of luck, ingenuity, and perhaps an extraordinary will to live, managed to persevere against unimaginable odds. They held the entire future of humanity in their hands. Their struggles, their adaptations, and their ultimate survival are the reason we are here today to tell their tale. This is the story of our deepest past, and it begins in a world of encroaching ice, under skies that may have grown dark with ash, on a planet that seemed determined to test its most audacious creation to the absolute limit. How can we possibly know about an event that occurred 70,000 years ago? A time that left behind no written records, no cities in ruins, no obvious monuments to its occurrence. The answer lies not in the ground beneath our feet, but within us. It is written in the most fundamental code of our being, our DNA. The story of the human bottleneck is, first and foremost, a story written in genes, a dramatic tale deciphered by scientists who learned to read the subtle variations in our genetic blueprint as a historical document. To understand this, we must first appreciate a simple but profound truth about genetics and population size. In a large, stable population, genetic diversity flourishes. A wide variety of gene variants, known as alleles, circulate through the population, constantly mixing and matching through reproduction. This diversity is the raw material for evolution, providing the variation upon which natural selection can act. However, when a population undergoes a drastic reduction in size or bottlenecked, this diversity is severely curtailed. It is akin to passing a rich and complex tapestry through the eye of a needle. Only a few threads make it through to the other side, and the resulting cloth, while still whole, is far less intricate and varied than the original. This is precisely the signature that geneticists discovered when they began to compare the human genome with those of our closest living relatives. Despite our global dominance and enormous population, Homo sapiens are surprisingly genetically uniform. The genetic difference between any two randomly selected humans is astonishingly small, far smaller than the differences observed between two chimpanzees from the same troop in Western Africa. Our species, for all its apparent variety in appearance and culture, is built on a remarkably homogeneous genetic foundation. This lack of diversity is the first great clue, the primary evidence that at some point in our past, our numbers became so small that a vast amount of our genetic variation was simply lost forever. The evidence for this bottleneck is found in two primary locations within our genome: nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA. Nuclear DNA is the vast library of genetic information contained within the nucleus of nearly every cell, inherited from both parents. Mitochondrial DNA, on the other hand, is a much smaller loop of genetic material found in the cellular organelles, called mitochondria, and it is passed down almost exclusively from mother to child. Because it does not recombine with paternal DNA each generation, it provides a cleaner, simpler lineage to trace back through time. Studies of mitochondrial DNA from people all over the world have been instrumental in tracing a maternal lineage back to a common ancestor, often nicknamed mitochondrial Eve, who lived in Africa around 200,000 years ago. But more importantly, the pattern of variation in this DNA allows scientists to estimate past population sizes. The calculations point unequivocally to a period around 70 to 80,000 years ago, when the effective population size, the number of breeding individuals, collapsed to a few thousand. The same story is told, though with more complexity, by the nuclear genome. The Y chromosome, passed from father to son, shows a similar bottleneck. Furthermore, the overall heterozygosity, the measure of genetic variation in human nuclear DNA, is low, consistent with a severe historical population contraction. This genetic bottleneck was not a brief event. The evidence suggests that our species lived in a state of critically low numbers for a considerable period, perhaps as long as 20,000 years. This was not a momentary pinch, but a prolonged stranglehold on humanity's throat. For generation after generation, this small population endured, their lives a constant struggle against the odds, their future perpetually hanging in the balance. During this time, random genetic drifter, change in frequency of gene variants due purely to chance in a small population, became a powerful evolutionary force. Traits and genes were lost, not because they were disadvantageous, but simply because the individuals who carried them failed to reproduce. A cruel game of genetic lottery. This period of isolation and scarcity also left its mark on our immune systems. The major histocompatibility complex MHC, a group of genes vital for recognizing and fighting off pathogens, shows reduced diversity in humans compared to other primates. This suggests that during the bottleneck, we lost many of our defensive genetic variants, potentially leaving the survivors more vulnerable to disease. It is a trade-off that echoes down the millennia. We survived as a species, but we may have carried forward a genetic susceptibility to certain illnesses as a permanent scar from that desperate time. Therefore, our DNA is not just a blueprint for building a human body, it is a palimpsest, a manuscript on which the history of our species has been written and rewritten. The faint, ghostly text beneath the modern writing tells a story of catastrophe and survival. It tells us that we are all, every one of us, more than just citizens of the same species. We are the descendants of a tiny group of survivors, the inheritors of a genetic legacy that passed through the narrowest of gates. We are all family in the most profound and literal sense, bound together by a shared ancestry that was forged in the crucible of near-extinction. This genetic evidence provides the undeniable what and the when. But to understand the why, we must look outward, to the world these few thousand individuals inhabited, a world that was turning against them in the most dramatic ways imaginable. The genetic code within us tells a story of a great struggle, but it does not, on its own, reveal the nature of the adversary. To understand the forces that conspired to reduce humanity to such a perilous state, we must step out of the microscopic world of genes and into the vast, sweeping theater of the ancient Earth. The stage was dominated by an immense and unpredictable actor, the climate. 70,000 years ago, our planet was not the relatively stable and warm world we know today. It was a place caught in the agonizing grip of an ice age, a world where stability was a rare luxury and change was the only constant. We exist now in a geological period known as an interglacial, a temporary warm pause between much longer periods of intense cold. The epoch we are concerned with, the late Pleistocene, was characterized by these long glacial periods, often simply called ice ages. During these times, massive continental ice sheets, sometimes over 2 miles thick, expanded from the poles, covering vast swathes of North America, Northern Europe, and Asia. These glaciers were not static. They were dynamic, colossal forces that sculpted continents. Their growth locked away enormous volumes of water, causing global sea levels to drop by over 100 meters compared to today. This exposed vast coastal plains, connected continents via land bridges, and completely altered the map of the world. What is now the Java Sea was a great plain, known as Sabaland. Australia was connected to New Guinea, forming a continent called Sahul. The Bering Land Bridge connected Siberia to Alaska, a grassy corridor known as Beringia. But the challenge for early humans was not just the cold, it was the volatility. The climate during this period was not consistently frigid, it was wildly erratic. The Earth's climate system entered a phase of extreme instability, characterized by what paleoclimatologists call Dansk-Gadoshka events. These were rapid, dramatic temperature fluctuations. Ice core records from Greenland reveal a startling pattern. Global temperatures could skyrocket, warming by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in just a few decades, blink of an eye in geological terms. These warm periods, however, were not lasting. They were often followed by an equally rapid descent back into bitter cold, or even into an ever deeper freeze, known as a Heinrich event, triggered by the armadas of icebergs, breaking off from the glacial sheets and melting into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents and plunging regions into deep cold. For the flora and fauna of the planet, this was a relentless nightmare. Ecosystems simply could not keep pace with such whiplash-inducing change. A region that over centuries had developed a stable mix of grasslands supporting herds of large game could within a few generations see those grasslands give way to dense forest, or worse, revert to a barren, frozen tundra. The familiar migratory routes of animals would vanish, food sources would disappear, and water, the most fundamental necessity, would become scarce or locked away in ice. For a species like Homo sapiens, which relied on sophisticated hunting techniques and a deep knowledge of local environments, this volatility was catastrophic. A band of hunters might have spent a lifetime mastering the pursuit of a specific type of antelope, learning its behaviors, its paths, its signs. Their entire cultural knowledge, passed down through stories and rituals, was a library dedicated to survival in a specific place. But when the climate shifted abruptly, that entire library could become obsolete overnight. The antelope might go extinct in the region, or move far away to a now inhospitable landscape. The edible plants they relied on might fail to fruit. The once reliable spring might dry up permanently. This placed an unimaginable cognitive and social strain on these early human communities. Their adaptability was being tested beyond its limits. The strategies that had served them for generations were rendered useless, forcing them to constantly innovate and experiment with new foods, new tools, and new territories, all while facing starvation, thirst, and the constant threat of predation. Social bonds would have been strained to the breaking point under such pressure. Resources that were once shared generously within a group would become jealously guarded. Conflict between groups competing for the same dwindling waterhole or the last herd of mammoths would have been fierce and brutal. The world had become a treacherous and unreliable place. The very ground upon which humanity's knowledge was built had become shifting sand. This prolonged period of climatic chaos created a background state of perpetual crisis, weakening human populations, fragmenting them into smaller and more isolated groups, and making them supremely vulnerable. It was the first act of the tragedy, setting the conditions for what was to come. The planet had grown hostile and unpredictable, but it was about to deliver a blow that was far more direct and far more devastating than mere capricious weather. The sky itself was preparing to turn against them. The genetic code within us tells a story of a great struggle, but it does not, on its own, reveal the nature of the adversary. To understand the forces that conspired to reduce humanity to such a perilous state, we must step out of the microscopic world of genes and into the vast, sweeping theater of the ancient Earth. The stage was dominated by an immense and unpredictable actor, the climate. 70,000 years ago, our planet was not the relatively stable and warm world we know today. It was a place caught in the agonizing grip of an ice age, a world where stability was a rare luxury and change was the only constant. We exist now in a geological period known as an interglacial, a temporary warm pause between much longer periods of intense cold. The epoch we are concerned with, the late Pleistocene, was characterized by these long glacial periods, often simply called ice ages. During these times, massive continental ice sheets, sometimes over 2 miles thick, expanded from the poles, covering vast swathes of North America, Northern Europe, and Asia. These glaciers were not static. They were dynamic, colossal forces that sculpted continents. Their growth locked away enormous volumes of water, causing global sea levels to drop by over 100 meters compared to today. This exposed vast coastal plains, connected continents via land bridges, and completely altered the map of the world. What is now the Java Sea was a great plain, known as Sabaland. Australia was connected to New Guinea, forming a continent called Sahul. The Bering Land Bridge connected Siberia to Alaska, a grassy corridor known as Beringia. But the challenge for early humans was not just the cold, it was the volatility. The climate during this period was not consistently frigid, it was wildly erratic. The Earth's climate system entered a phase of extreme instability, characterized by what paleoclimatologists call Dansk-Gadoshka events. These were rapid, dramatic temperature fluctuations. Ice core records from Greenland reveal a startling pattern. Global temperatures could skyrocket, warming by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in just a few decades, blink of an eye in geological terms. These warm periods, however, were not lasting. They were often followed by an equally rapid descent back into bitter cold, or even into an ever deeper freeze, known as a Heinrich event, triggered by the armadas of icebergs, breaking off from the glacial sheets and melting into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents and plunging regions into deep cold. For the flora and fauna of the planet, this was a relentless nightmare. Ecosystems simply could not keep pace with such whiplash-inducing change. A region that over centuries had developed a stable mix of grasslands supporting herds of large game could within a few generations see those grasslands give way to dense forest, or worse, revert to a barren, frozen tundra. The familiar migratory routes of animals would vanish, food sources would disappear, and water, the most fundamental necessity, would become scarce or locked away in ice. For a species like Homo sapiens, which relied on sophisticated hunting techniques and a deep knowledge of local environments, this volatility was catastrophic. A band of hunters might have spent a lifetime mastering the pursuit of a specific type of antelope, learning its behaviors, its paths, its signs. Their entire cultural knowledge, passed down through stories and rituals, was a library dedicated to survival in a specific place. But when the climate shifted abruptly, that entire library could become obsolete overnight. The antelope might go extinct in the region, or move far away to a now inhospitable landscape. The edible plants they relied on might fail to fruit. The once reliable spring might dry up permanently. This placed an unimaginable cognitive and social strain on these early human communities. Their adaptability was being tested beyond its limits. The strategies that had served them for generations were rendered useless, forcing them to constantly innovate and experiment with new foods, new tools, and new territories, all while facing starvation, thirst, and the constant threat of predation. Social bonds would have been strained to the breaking point under such pressure. Resources that were once shared generously within a group would become jealously guarded. Conflict between groups competing for the same dwindling waterhole or the last herd of mammoths would have been fierce and brutal. The world had become a treacherous and unreliable place. The very ground upon which humanity's knowledge was built had become shifting sand. This prolonged period of climatic chaos created a background state of perpetual crisis, weakening human populations, fragmenting them into smaller and more isolated groups, and making them supremely vulnerable. It was the first act of the tragedy, setting the conditions for what was to come. The planet had grown hostile and unpredictable, but it was about to deliver a blow that was far more direct and far more devastating than mere capricious weather. The sky itself was preparing to turn against them. In the stark and challenging world of 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were not the sole bearers of the torch of humanity. Our species was, in fact, a relatively new arrival on a stage already occupied by other hominins, other kinds of people who had adapted to life in Eurasia over hundreds of thousands of years. As our ancestors ventured out of Africa and into new continents, they did not find empty lands waiting for them. They found territories that were already home to well-established, intelligent, and physically powerful human species. The most famous of these were the Neanderthals, but they were not alone. There were also the Denisovans in Asia, and likely other groups, such as the diminutive Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores, and possibly even relict populations of Homo erectus. The struggle for survival, therefore, was not just against a hostile climate and a failing ecosystem. It was also a competition with our evolutionary cousins. The Neanderthals are often misrepresented in popular culture as brutish, simple-minded cavemen, a depiction that is grossly unfair and utterly incorrect. In reality, they were a highly successful and supremely adapted human species. They had dominated Europe and Western Asia for over 300,000 years, enduring multiple glacial cycles far more severe than anything our own species had ever experienced. Their physical form was a masterpiece of adaptation to cold climates. Stocky barrel-chested bodies, with shorter limbs that minimized surface area and reduced heat loss. Large broad noses that were efficient at warming and humidifying the cold, dry air. And a metabolic engine likely tuned for a high-protein diet and extreme endurance. They were powerful, muscular, and incredibly resilient. Their culture was sophisticated. They were masterful big-game hunters, taking down formidable prey like woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant deer using advanced close-quarter hunting techniques that required immense courage and skill. They manufactured complex stone tools using the Levallois technique, which allowed for the production of fine, flake-based implements. There is compelling evidence that they used ochre, perhaps for symbolic or decorative purposes, and that they buried their dead, sometimes with grave goods, suggesting a capacity for ritual and abstract thought. They were not primitive, they were different. They were specialists, exquisitely evolved for the specific challenges of Pleistocene Eurasia. When Homo sapiens began to migrate into these territories, the encounter was not a simple story of superior intellect effortlessly overcoming an inferior competitor. For a long time, it appears that Neanderthals held the advantage. They knew the land, the seasons, the habits of the prey animals. They were physically stronger and perhaps better insulated against the cold. The initial forays of Homo sapiens into the Middle East, for example, around 100,000 years ago, seem to have been brief and unsuccessful, perhaps beaten back by the resident Neanderthals, or by their own inability to cope with the unfamiliar environment. The crucial period of the bottleneck, however, changed the calculus of this competition. The climatic chaos and the potential aftermath of the Toba eruption would have placed immense pressure on all hominin populations. Resources became critically scarce, the great herds thinned out, plant foods became unreliable, and safe shelter was harder to find. This scarcity would have intensified competition to a violent degree. encounters between different human groups at a water source or a carcass would have shifted from potential curiosity to lethal conflict. In this new, harsher world, the established specialists, the Neanderthals, may have faced their own challenges. Their high-energy bodies, optimized for hunting massive game, may have become a liability when that game disappeared. They required more calories to sustain their robust frames, and in a world of famine, that could have been a fatal disadvantage. This is where the particular strengths of Homo sapiens may have begun to tell. While Neanderthals were specialists, Homo sapiens were the ultimate generalists. Our cognitive architecture may have granted us a greater behavioral flexibility. Faced with the collapse of large game populations, we might have been quicker to adapt, to shift to a broader diet. Evidence suggests that Homo sapiens began exploiting a much wider range of food sources, including fish, birds, small mammals, and a greater variety of plants. A dietary breadth that Neanderthals seem to have employed less frequently. This ability to eat anything would have been a monumental advantage during a widespread ecological failure. Furthermore, our social structures might have been different. Some theorists propose that Homo sapiens developed larger, more extensive, and more cooperative social networks than other hominids. The ability to maintain ties and exchange information and resources with other bands over longer distances could have created a crucial safety net. If one group failed to find food, they might be able to rely on alliances with another group. This collective brain, the ability to pool knowledge and resources across a wider population, could have been the key to weathering a crisis that fragmented and isolated other species. The competition was likely a complex mix of direct violence, economic competition, and a subtle but relentless squeezing out of ecological niches. We were not necessarily better hunters in their own environment, but we may have been better at adapting when that environment changed beyond recognition. The prolonged crisis of the bottleneck would have been a great filter. It tested every species' survival strategy to the absolute limit. For the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and others, their strategies, though successful for hundreds of millennia, ultimately failed in the face of this unprecedented combination of climatic and ecological disasters. Their populations dwindled and faded away, leaving behind only fragments of their DNA in our own genome, a silent testimony to ancient encounters. The world after the bottleneck was emptier. The other voices in the human family had fallen silent, but the struggle was not over for Homo sapiens. Having survived the cataclysm and outlasted their competitors, the small, scattered bands of survivors now faced their greatest challenge, not just to endure, but to rebuild, to expand, and to claim a world that had been so nearly lost. Their story becomes one of resilience, innovation, and a final fateful push into every corner of the globe. The world was a crucible, and the fires of climate change, volcanic winter, and fierce competition were burning intensely. For the small, fragmented bands of Homo sapiens that found themselves clinging to existence around 70,000 years ago, mere endurance was not enough. Survival required something more. It demanded a paradigm shift in behavior, technology, and social organization. The genetic bottleneck was not just a period of loss. It was also a period of intense innovation and adaptation, a forge in which the key traits that define modern humanity were tempered and sharpened. The groups that made it through were not simply lucky. They were the ones who pioneered new and more effective ways of being human. One of the most critical advantages may have been a revolution in technology and resource use. Prior to the bottleneck, Homo sapiens toolkits, while advanced, were not dramatically superior to those of Neanderthals. But during this period of extreme pressure, we see evidence of a significant cognitive leap manifested in material culture. This is the emergence of what archaeologists call behavioral modernity, a suite of complex behaviors that include sophisticated, standardized tool-making, symbolic thought, and economic intensification. Stone tools became more refined and diverse. There was a shift towards making smaller, more specialized implements, like finely worked bladelets that could be hafted onto spears or arrows to create composite weapons. These were more efficient, required less raw material, and could be repaired easily. A crucial advantage when resources were scarce and mobility was key. Perhaps even more important was the expansion of what anthropologists call the diet breadth. While other hominins were often specialized hunters of large game, the survivors of the bottleneck began to exploit the entire landscape with unprecedented intensity. They became experts in extracting nutrition from every possible source. This included the systematic harvesting of shellfish along coastlines, the trapping of small mammals and birds, the development of fishing techniques using nets and barbed points, and the detailed knowledge of dozens of plant species, including how to process toxic roots and nuts to make them edible. This dietary flexibility was a monumental buffer against famine. If the mammoths disappeared, there were still turtles in the stream, nuts in the trees, and mussels on the rocks. This ability to fall back on a wider range of less prestigious but more reliable food sources would have been a game-changer in a collapsing world. Underpinning this technological and economic revolution was a social one. The extreme environment likely placed a premium on cooperation and social complexity. Survival would have depended on the strength of the group, and this required new levels of social cohesion and organization. Language, which was undoubtedly present before, may have become more complex and symbolic, allowing for the precise sharing of information about distant resources, the coordination of hunting strategies, and the transmission of intricate knowledge across generations. Storytelling, myth, and art may have emerged as powerful tools for strengthening group identity, reinforcing social norms, and creating a shared cultural world that provided meaning and comfort in a time of immense hardship. Evidence for this blossoming of symbolic thought appears around this time, although the record is still debated. The use of ochre for body painting or ritual, the creation of simple engravings on ochre nodules or ostrich eggshells, and the earliest evidence of personal adornment, like shell beads, all point to a mind that was not only concerned with subsistence, but also with identity and symbolism. These artifacts are the fingerprints of a modern human consciousness. They suggest the ability to think in abstract terms, to create and share symbols, and to maintain relationships through shared culture and ritual. This cognitive toolkit allowed for larger, more stable social networks, where Neanderthal social groups appear to have been smaller and more localized. Homo sapiens may have developed the capacity to maintain alliances with other bands over large distances. This created a form of insurance. If one group suffered a local disaster, they could seek refuge with allies elsewhere, ensuring the survival of their genes and their knowledge. This period of isolation also had a profound effect on our genetics, driving natural selection in specific directions. In the brutal reality of the bottleneck, certain traits would have been powerfully selected for, traits that favored extreme cooperation within the group. A willingness to share food and care for the weak and injured would have increased the overall survival of the band. Conversely, a deep wariness of outsiders, a capacity for aggression in defense of critical resources, would also have been advantageous. This may have cemented within us a complex dual nature, a profound capacity for empathy and altruism towards our in-group, coupled with a deep-seated suspicion and potential for violence towards outsiders. The bottleneck may have hardwired into us the very best and the very worst of our social nature. The survivors, therefore, were not the strongest in a purely physical sense, nor were they merely the most brutish. They were the smartest, the most adaptable, the most cooperative, and the most socially complex. They were the ones who could innovate a new tool, remember a forgotten water source, care for a pregnant woman to ensure the next generation, and maintain a friendship with a band 50 miles away. They possessed a behavioral plasticity that allowed them to constantly change their strategies to meet new challenges. They were the generalists who could thrive in a world of specialists, and when the world changed so drastically that the specialists could no longer survive, it was the generalists, the nimble-minded, the socially connected, who inherited the earth. They passed through the eye of the needle, not by force, but by foresight, flexibility, and an unbreakable bond with one another. Their story was one of resilience, and having survived the deepest valley, they now stood on the brink of a new dawn, ready to expand into a world left empty. The long winter, in whatever form it took, did not last forever. Gradually, over centuries, the veil of ash settled from the atmosphere. The planet's climate, though still firmly in the grip of the Ice Age, began to stabilize into a new, if colder, normal. The intense volcanic winter receded, and though the glaciers remained, the extreme volatility of the Dansgaard-Doshgar events may have lessened for a time. The Earth began to heal, and ecosystems, though scarred and transformed, started to recover. Grasses and trees recolonized the ash-strewn landscapes. Animal populations, from the smallest rodents to the largest herbivores, began their slow rebound from the brink. For the tiny, scattered bands of Homo sapiens who had endured the long night, A new world was emerging, a world of opportunity, empty of competitors and ripe for colonization. This period, following the bottleneck, marks the beginning of the most remarkable chapter in human history, the final and permanent dispersal of Homo sapiens across the entire globe. The genetic evidence shows a dramatic change. The population, once constricted to a perilously low number, began to expand, and it did not just expand in place, it exploded outward, a wave of humanity radiating from its African refuge in all directions. This was the dawn of true globalization, a human conquest of the planet that was unprecedented in its speed and scale. The routes of this expansion were dictated by geography and climate. One group moved northwards and eastwards, following the coastlines of the Arabian Peninsula and India. These were not marches of conquest, but slow, incremental movements of hunter-gatherer families, perhaps traveling just a few kilometers per generation. They were beachcombers, exploiting the rich and reliable resources of the coastal margins. The sea provided a constant bounty of shellfish, fish, and seabirds, a nutritious and predictable food source that could support a growing population. This coastal highway eventually led them through Southeast Asia, across the land bridges of Sunderland, and onward towards Australia. The peopling of Australia, which occurred around 65,000 to 50,000 years ago, stands as a testament to the newfound audacity and technological skill of post-bottleneck humans. Reaching Australia was not a matter of simply walking. It required a sea crossing, a voyage across open water to a shore that could not be seen from the point of departure. This implies the use of some form of watercraft, probably rudimentary rafts or boats, and a level of planning and cooperation that speaks volumes about their cognitive abilities. Stepping onto the shores of Australia, they entered a world completely isolated for millions of years, a land of bizarre marsupial megafauna. They had become true explorers, entering a new ecological realm and adapting to it with incredible speed. Another major wave moved north and west, into the heart of Neanderthal territory in the Middle East and Europe. This time, the outcome was different. The Neanderthals, already weakened by the climatic disasters and their own lack of genetic diversity, were unable to resist the advance of these new, behaviorally flexible humans. The encounter was likely a complex process lasting thousands of years, involving competition, conflict, and occasional interbreeding. But the result, over time, was the same: the gradual absorption and replacement of the Neanderthals. By around 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were the sole human occupants of Europe. A similar story played out in the East. Groups moved into Central Asia, a harsh and demanding landscape, and then turned south into the Indian subcontinent and north into the frigid steppes of Siberia. Here, they encountered and interbred with another branch of the human family, the Denisovans. The descendants of these Siberian groups would eventually achieve one of humanity's most incredible feats: the colonization of the most extreme environments on Earth. Adapting to the bitter cold of the Arctic, they developed sophisticated technologies like tailored clothing, advanced shelter construction, and specialized hunting techniques for mammoth and other cold-adapted fauna. Around 16,000 years ago, during a period of lower sea levels, they crossed the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, spreading with astonishing speed from the frozen north to the tip of South America within a few millennia. This great expansion was fueled by the very adaptations that had ensured survival during the bottleneck: technological innovation, dietary flexibility, and complex social networks. The same skills that allowed a band to survive on shellfish and seeds during a volcanic winter now allowed them to adapt to the deserts of Australia, the frozen tundra of Siberia, and the rainforests of the Amazon. The ability to maintain long-distance social ties meant that knowledge of new technologies, new environments, and new resources could spread faster than the people themselves, paving the way for successful migration. The genetic bottleneck had created a genetic and cultural founder effect. The entire population of the world descended from a small group who possessed a specific set of adaptive traits. As they expanded, they carried this genetic legacy and this cultural toolkit with them, adapting it to every new corner of the world they entered. The struggle for survival had forged a new kind of human, one that was resilient, inventive, and supremely adaptable. The world that had nearly ended our species now became our domain. From a few thousand individuals huddled in refugia, humanity was on the verge of becoming a global force, setting the stage for the next revolutions in art, agriculture, and civilization that would forever change the planet. The event that brought humanity to the brink of extinction 70,000 years ago did not simply end when the population recovered and expanded. Such a profound demographic catastrophe leaves scars, and its legacy is deeply embedded in who we are today, etched into our very biology, and perhaps even into the foundations of our societies and our minds. The bottleneck was not just a historical event. It was a formative experience that shaped the genetic and psychological template of modern humanity, creating a series of paradoxes that we still grapple with. The most direct and undeniable legacy is genetic. As we have discussed, the lack of genetic diversity in our species is a direct consequence of that population crash. Every human on Earth is far more genetically similar to every other human than individuals in most other primate species are to each other. This has profound implications. It means that, from a biological standpoint, the concept of race is a superficial social construct, based on a tiny number of recently selected genes related to local adaptations, like skin color or lactose tolerance. Beneath these surface variations, we are all, to a remarkable degree, the same. This genetic homogeneity also makes us uniquely vulnerable to certain threats. A disease that evolves to effectively target one of us can potentially target all of us, as our immune systems, with their reduced MHC diversity, share many of the same strengths and weaknesses. The bottleneck, in a sense, made us a single, global tribe, but it also made us a single, global target. This event may have also acted as a powerful accelerator of human evolution. In a small, isolated population, beneficial genetic mutations can spread much more rapidly through the group than in a large, diffuse one. The intense selection pressures of the bottleneck, the famine, the disease, the social strife would have powerfully favored any trait that increased an individual's chances of survival and reproduction. It is possible that key cognitive mutations related to language planning and social intelligence, which may have been present in a minority of the population before the crisis, spread like wildfire through the surviving groups because they conferred such an immense advantage. The bottleneck, therefore, might have been the crucible that forged the modern human mind, selecting for the very intelligence, creativity, and social sophistication that would later fuel our global dominance. Beyond the genes, the experience may have left a deep psychological imprint, a kind of cultural memory, or a set of ingrained behavioral biases. Surviving such a catastrophe required a specific set of social behaviors. Extreme cooperation and altruism within one's own immediate group would have been essential for sharing scarce resources, caring for the young and injured, and defending against predators and rivals. This could have hardwired into us a powerful capacity for empathy, compassion, and loyalty towards those we consider us. However, the same conditions would have also favored a deep suspicion and aggression towards them. Other bands of humans who were competing for the same desperate resources. This duality, intense in-group loyalty coupled with out-group hostility, is a recurring theme in human history and conflict. The roots of our greatest capacities for love and sacrifice, as well as our darkest tendencies for prejudice and genocide, may have been seeded in the desperate struggle of the bottleneck. This period may also be the origin of our profound fear of scarcity, and our drive to acquire and hoard resources, even when they are abundant. For generations, the central, overriding fact of human existence was a lack of food, water, and safety. Those who were driven by a constant low-level anxiety to store a little more, to secure just a bit extra, would have been the ones who survived the next famine. This ancestral memory of scarcity, etched into our neural pathways, could manifest today in everything from economic consumerism and hoarding disorders to the relentless exploitation of the planet's resources. We are a species forever preparing for a winter that, for most of us, has long since passed. Furthermore, the bottleneck could explain our powerful need for storytelling and myth-making. In the depths of that long crisis, stories would have been more than entertainment. They would have been vital survival tools. Stories carried crucial information about hunting grounds, water sources, and edible plants. They reinforced social bonds, transmitted cultural values, and provided explanations for a terrifying and unpredictable world. The groups that developed rich mythologies, creation stories, tales of heroes and monsters, rituals to appease the forces of nature, would have had a stronger sense of identity and purpose, increasing their cohesion and resilience. This innate drive to find patterns, create narratives, and believe in forces greater than ourselves may be a direct inheritance from our ancestors, who looked into the darkened sky and the barren land and had to find a reason to hope. The legacy of the bottleneck is thus a complex tapestry. It made us unified but vulnerable. It may have accelerated our intelligence while also embedding deep-seated anxieties and tribal instincts. It left us with a planet to ourselves, but also with the psychological scars of a species that remembers, on some fundamental level, what it is like to be alone in the dark, staring into the abyss. We are the children of survivors, and the experience of that survival continues to shape our world. From our biological vulnerabilities to our social structures and our deepest fears and aspirations, understanding this legacy is key to understanding ourselves, not as the inevitable masters of the planet, but as the fortunate descendants of the few who endured and who carried with them the lessons, both good and ill, of that brush with oblivion. The story of the human bottleneck is a dramatic one, a tale of ice fire and a desperate struggle for survival. But how can we be confident in narrating events that transpired so long ago, in a world without witnesses? This confidence does not spring from a single source, but from the convergence of multiple, independent lines of scientific evidence. Like detectives piecing together a crime scene from fragments of clues, paleoanthropologists, geneticists, climatologists, and archaeologists have assembled this narrative by learning to read the subtle messages left behind in ancient rocks, ice bones, and most importantly in our own cells. The picture is not yet complete, and debates rage over the details, but the overall framework is supported by a powerful and interdisciplinary case. The first and most compelling line of evidence comes from genetics. The revelation of the bottleneck emerged from the ability to sequence the human genome and compare it with those of our closest relatives. The process relies on several key principles. One is the concept of the molecular clock. This is the idea that genetic mutations accumulate in DNA at a relatively steady rate over time. By comparing the number of differences between the DNA of two species, or between two populations within a species, scientists can estimate how long ago they shared a common ancestor. When applied globally to human populations, this clock pointed to a recent common ancestor for all modern humans, and a significant reduction in population size around the same time. Another genetic technique involves analyzing linkage, disequilibrium. This is a measure of how certain blocks of genes are inherited together. In a large, old population, these blocks get broken up over time through generations of genetic recombination. In a population that has recently expanded from a small founder group, these blocks remain unusually large and linked together. The human genome shows extensive linkage, disequilibrium, consistent with a recent, rapid expansion from a very small population. Furthermore, the study of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA, which are passed down with minimal change, allows scientists to trace maternal and paternal lineages back to single ancestors, confirming that our entire species descended from a limited number of founding mothers and fathers. The second major line of evidence comes from paleoclimatology, the study of past climates. Scientists do not have weather reports from 70,000 years ago, but they have something almost as good: natural archives. Ice cores drilled from the ancient ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica are perhaps the most remarkable. Each year's snowfall is compressed into a layer of ice, trapping within it tiny bubbles of the ancient atmosphere and chemical compounds that serve as proxies for temperature. By analyzing these cores, scientists can reconstruct annual temperature records going back hundreds of thousands of years, revealing the dramatic Dansgaard-Doschger events and the precise timing of volcanic eruptions through layers of sulfate deposits. Similarly, ocean sediment cores and lake bed cores provide long-term records. Pollen grains preserved in these sediments tell us what plants were dominant, painting a picture of past ecosystems. Dust levels indicate aridity, and the shells of tiny marine organisms, foraminifera, contain chemical signatures that record ocean temperatures and ice volume. These climate records provide the essential context, showing that the period in question was one of extreme volatility and potential disaster, creating the environmental pressure cooker needed to cause a population collapse. The third line of evidence is the archaeological record, the physical remains left behind by our ancestors. This evidence is more fragmentary and open to interpretation, but it is crucial. The disappearance of Neanderthal sites from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago coinciding with the appearance of new, more advanced stone tool technologies associated with Homo sapiens, tells the story of replacement and expansion. The Toba ash layer itself is a key archaeological marker. This distinct layer of volcanic glass shards has been found across the Indian Ocean, in Asia, and even in 2 archaeological sites in South Africa. Finding this layer at a site allows for precise dating and helps archaeologists understand if humans were present before and after the eruption, providing a snapshot of its impact. However, the story is not without its controversies. The Toba catastrophe theory is hotly debated. Some researchers argue that the climate proxies do not show a severe enough winter to cause a global bottleneck. Others point to archaeological sites in India, such as Julapuram, where stone tools appear both above and below the Toba ash layer, suggesting that human populations in that region may have survived the eruption. Critics of the theory argued that the climate instability of the Ice Age alone, without a supereruption, could have been sufficient to cause the population decline. The debate is a healthy and essential part of the scientific process. It drives researchers to seek better data, to refine their models, and to consider alternative explanations. Perhaps Toba was the final, decisive blow for a species already on the ropes from climatic chaos. Perhaps its effects were more regional, devastating populations in Asia, while leaving those in Africa relatively unscathed. The exact trigger may still be elusive, but the combined weight of the genetic, climatic, and archaeological evidence makes the fact of the bottleneck itself increasingly difficult to deny. Science is not about proving a single truth, but about building the most robust and evidence-based narrative possible. The story of the bottleneck is a powerful example of this collaborative multidisciplinary detective work, where each new Discordia genome sequenced an ice core, analyzed a stone tool, adds another piece to the puzzle of our own origins, slowly bringing our deepest past into focus. Our journey through deep time, guided by the twin lanterns of genetics and geology, brings us to a final, humbling, and ultimately empowering conclusion. The story of the bottleneck 70,000 years ago is not a remote archaeological curiosity. It is the foundational epic of our species. It is the story of how we almost weren't, and of the extraordinary resilience that carried the flickering flame of human consciousness through the deepest darkness. To understand this event is to fundamentally reshape our understanding of ourselves, our place in the natural world, and our responsibilities to the future. The image of a few thousand individuals, huddled in isolated refugia across Africa and perhaps parts of Asia, is a powerful corrective to the myth of human inevitability. For too long, we have viewed our ascent as a linear, triumphant march to dominance. The reality, as revealed by the genetic and climatic evidence, is far more dramatic and far more fragile. Our existence today is the product of chance, of luck, and of the fierce tenacity of a handful of communities who refused to let the light go out. They endured years of volcanic winter. They adapted to shifting ecosystems. They competed with other forms of humanity. And they passed on not just their genes, but their knowledge, their culture, and their will to survive. We are not the preordained masters of the planet. We are the lucky descendants of the ultimate survivors. This realization fosters a profound sense of unity. The superficial differences of ethnicity, nationality, and culture that often divide us are just that, superficial. The genetic evidence is unequivocal. We are all, every single one of the 8 billion people on Earth, members of an incredibly young and closely related family. The branches of our family tree may have spread to every continent and adapted to every environment, but the trunk is recent and narrow. We share a common ancestry that is astonishingly recent, and a common history that passed through the narrowest of genetic filters. The story of the bottleneck reminds us that we are bound together by a shared legacy of catastrophe and survival. This history also imbues us with a deep responsibility. If our species was shaped by a brush with extinction triggered by environmental catastrophe, it gives us a unique perspective on the planetary crisis we face today. We are now the architects of a new kind of global change, altering the climate and ecosystems of the Earth with a speed and scale that rivals the natural forces that once threatened us. The difference is that now we are the volcanic eruption. We are the climate shift. Understanding the bottleneck should serve as a stark warning of how vulnerable a species can be to rapid environmental change, even one as adaptable as ours. It is a lesson from our deepest past about the existential risks of ignoring the balance of the natural world. Yet, the story is ultimately one of hope. It is a testament to human ingenuity, behavioral flexibility, and social cooperation. Our ancestors survived because they could innovate new tools, because they could learn to eat new foods, because they could care for each other, and because they could form alliances that extended beyond their immediate kin. These are the same qualities we must summon today to navigate the challenges of the modern world. The same cognitive toolkit that allowed a band of humans to survive on a desolate coast 70,000 years ago is the one we now use to build complex societies, create transformative technologies, and seek scientific understanding. The problem-solving and cooperative skills that were selected for in the crucible of the bottleneck are our greatest inheritance and our greatest hope for the future. The tale of the bottleneck is our origin story, more dramatic and more true than any myth. It tells us that we are not defined by innate superiority, but by adaptability. It tells us that our strength has never lain in individual might, but in collective intelligence and shared purpose. We are a species forged in crisis, and that experience is etched into our DNA. It has left us with both the capacity for great compassion and a tendency for deep tribalism, with a drive to create and a fear of scarcity. To understand this history is to understand these contradictions within ourselves. As we look to the stars and contemplate our future, we would do well to remember our past. We are the children of a long winter. We carry within us the resilience of those who endured, the ingenuity of those who adapted, and the hope of those who looked upon a devastated world and dared to rebuild. We are the legacy of the few who survived. Let that knowledge unite us, humble us, and inspire us to ensure that the flame they guarded so fiercely continues to burn brightly for generations to come. 70,000 years is a span of time so vast it defies easy comprehension. It represents over 2,500 generations of human lives, each one a link in an unbroken chain stretching from that distant, desperate past to this present moment. If we listen closely, beyond the noise of modern life, we can still hear a faint echo from that time, a whisper carried on the currents of our DNA. It is not a whisper of triumph, but of perseverance. It is the story of us, the world our ancestors inherited after the bottleneck was empty and quiet. The great hominin competitors were gone, their chapter closed. The landscapes were recovering, filled with new potential. The small bands of Homo sapiens, now equipped with the hard-won tools of survival, began to move, tentatively at first, and then with growing confidence. They carried with them the lessons of the bottleneck, the imperative to cooperate, the need to innovate, the wisdom to use every resource the land offered, and the profound understanding that their strength was in their community. This expansion was not a conquest, but a rediscovery of a world. With each new valley they entered, each new mountain range they crossed, each new ocean shore they reached, they applied the old lessons to new challenges. They painted their dreams on cave walls at Lascaux and Chauvet, creating breathtaking art that spoke of a world teeming with life and spirit. They carved intricate figurines from mammoth ivory, they fashioned musical instruments from bone, and they began to bury their dead with ceremony and grave goods, suggesting a growing complexity in their thoughts about life, death, and what might lie beyond. The bottleneck had created a genetic and cultural bottleneck, but on the other side of that constraint, humanity blossomed with a spectacular diversity of cultures, languages, and technologies. The uniformity of crisis gave way to the creativity of stability. The same behavioral plasticity that allowed for survival now allowed for an explosion of cultural expression. The seeds of everything that was to come: agriculture, writing, cities, science, and space exploration were present in the minds of those few thousand survivors. They carried the potential for all of it. Today, we stand as the living proof of their resilience. Every time we solve a complex problem through collaboration, every time we share knowledge, every time we create a work of art, we are honoring that legacy. We are fulfilling the potential that was so nearly lost. The story of the bottleneck is the ultimate reminder of the preciousness and fragility of human civilization. It did not have to be. We are here, against improbable odds. Therefore, this story does not end in the past. It is a continuous narrative in which we are all active participants. The challenges we face today: climate change, resource depletion, global pandemics, the risk of conflict are, in their own way, modern versions of the ancient pressures that once threatened to erase us. They are tests of the same adaptive capabilities. The question is, will we learn from the past? Will we choose the path of cooperation over conflict, of innovation over stagnation, of long-term wisdom over short-term gain? Will we prove ourselves to be worthy heirs to the legacy of the survivors? The few hundred who became the many billions have now reached another pivotal moment in their story. The future is uncertain, but it is not without hope. For we are the children of the bottleneck. We are made of stardust and ice, forged by fire and hardship. We carry within us the strength of those who endured the long winter. Our responsibility, our privilege, and our destiny are to ensure that their story, our story, continues for generations yet to come. The world is waiting to see what the survivors will do next.